They checked the list twice. "Sorry, sir, you're not on here." She didn't look up after saying it, just moved on to the next name with a mechanical smile. Behind me, someone whispered, not quietly enough, "Maybe he just wants free food." A couple of them chuckled. I didn't say a word, just stood there for a moment. The air smelled like expensive perfume and overcooked salmon. Laughter echoed through the wide hall, soft jazz playing somewhere above the chatter. I could feel the weight of every eye not looking at me directly, but definitely seeing me. I turned around slowly, walked back down the steps and stepped outside. The night was sharp, dry. I could smell the metal from the nearby fountain. My hands were steady, my heart wasn't racing. I pulled out my phone and made one call. No words, just a silent confirmation. It wasn't about the dinner, it wasn't about the insult. It was about what I already knew, and what they had no idea I was about to do. For 5 years I funded that foundation. Quietly, anonymously, $500,000. No expectations, no applause, just impact. I watched them grow, speak, smile, cut ribbons in front of schools I paid for. I saw the names on those banners, not mine, and felt nothing but pride until 6 months ago. That's when she came in, the new executive director. Young, polished, political, she made changes. Fast ones, staff turnover, vendor contracts reshuffled, new names appearing on the payroll, and for some reason my name started disappearing. Emails went unanswered. Reports stopped coming. The foundation's newsletters, which always used to land in my inbox, just stopped. I didn't panic, I didn't even confront, I documented. I watched, I waited. This gala, this dinner, was supposed to be her big night. Her achievement showcase. They used my last donation to rent the venue, cater the food, hire the speakers, and then they crossed the line. They removed me, not just from the invite list, but from the narrative, erased, as if I had never existed. But you see, I had written the check and I knew something they didn't. The books didn't match. I had already seen the inconsistencies, the redirections, the hush payments disguised as consulting fees. I had a friend, one of the few people who remembered how this all started, watching the ledgers with me. A lawyer now, discreet, loyal. So, when they laughed at me at the door, it wasn't anger I felt, it was confirmation. I walked away with a calm only truth can bring. I watched from a distance as they toasted to their success. I knew who was sitting at each table, what each speech would pretend to stand for, and I knew what was coming, because while I stood outside in the cold, they were drinking wine I had paid for, smiling under chandeliers I had unknowingly rented, celebrating. Of course, they had quietly corrupted. But justice doesn't always come with a hammer. Sometimes it comes with silence and precision. That night, I wasn't angry. I was ready. I met Margaret at a city council volunteer drive. I was in my early 40s, divorced, busy with work, not really looking for anything. She was vibrant, persuasive, always 5 steps ahead in a conversation. She ran a small community non-profit, focused on education access, underfunded, overworked, but with fire in her voice. We started slow. Coffee turned into shared project work. Project work became dinners, weekends, a life. By the time I turned 50, we were married and co-running a small foundation that had started with just a few $1,000s in community grants. I kept my full-time job in engineering, but my heart began migrating toward what we were building. We didn't have children, not by choice, not by fate, just the way things turned out. Our foundation became our legacy. Scholarships, technical programs, after-school mentorships. We didn't chase publicity, and I certainly didn't want my name plastered everywhere. It wasn't about recognition. It was about balance, opportunity. Then 10 years in, cancer took Margaret, quietly, with grace I didn't know was humanly possible. She passed on a Tuesday. I remember the light from the window that morning. Too soft for what was happening. For months I functioned like a machine, went back to work, signed checks, attended board meetings in silence, smiled at donors I didn't care for. But I didn't let the foundation die. If anything, I doubled down. Her name stayed on the charter. Her voice stayed in my head every time we picked a new student or launched a new course. It was the only part of her I could still build with. Over time, the foundation grew. We hired a team, streamlined operations, moved into a modest office space. I stayed off the board, kept my role unofficial, just wrote checks and showed up when it mattered. Then came the shift. A donor suggested we bring in someone modern, someone with a communications background to elevate the brand. That's how Olivia came in. Young, sharp, highly educated, impressive on paper. She had experience running campaigns for large non-profits and brought with her connections, sponsors, buzz. At first it was electric, new energy, bigger galas, more polished events. The newsletters started looking like luxury catalogues. But I noticed the subtle displacements. Long-time staff were nudged out quietly. Restructuring, they said. Programs that weren't glamorous enough, especially those for low-income technical training, were paused for re-evaluation. And Olivia. She didn't ask about Margaret, never mentioned her, never looked me in the eye when we crossed paths at events. Then came the signs that couldn't be ignored. Board meetings moved to private locations. I was no longer notified. Reports stopped coming. Small invoices for catering or rentals doubled in cost, then tripled. One event had a line item for consultation and outreach billed at $25,000. The payee, her cousin's PR firm, newly registered. I asked questions, polite ones at first. The answers came sugar-coated, vague, or simply never arrived, so I stopped asking. Instead, I started saving emails, event records, payment trails. I opened a separate folder in my cloud drive, gave it a simple name, continuity. At some point, I knew I wasn't being paranoid. I was being prepared, because the legacy Margaret and I had built was becoming unrecognizable. A showroom for egos instead of a workshop for futures, and no one seemed to notice, or maybe they just didn't care. But I did, and that's when I realized, if I wanted to preserve what we started, I had to stop waiting for someone else to care. I began attending fewer events, not out of bitterness, just observation. The smiles were louder, the handshakes longer, the speeches polished to perfection, but something essential was missing, the quiet sincerity, the dignity of real work. The people we used to serve now felt like decorative statistics in slideshows. Still, I didn't push back, not directly. I simply shifted my role from supporter to observer. I changed how I donated, smaller amounts, delivered through third-party channels, just to track how they'd be processed. Invoices started arriving with different figures. Allocations didn't match the purposes I specified. I kept quiet. I also began collecting physical evidence. I stored documents in an old lockbox at home, contracts, correspondence, reports. They assumed no one would verify. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was preparing a record, a memory bank of integrity. One day I asked Olivia for a simple update, a routine check-in about a youth program we had funded from the beginning. Her reply was almost dismissive. That initiative has been merged with a more inclusive model. We're rebranding. Rebranding, that was the word. Not rebuilding, not expanding, not sustaining, just rebranding. That was the moment I knew we were speaking different languages. Hers was PR, optics, noise. Mine was legacy, roots, silence. I kept my face neutral, thanked her, walked away. But inside, something shifted. For good. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. I began drafting a letter, not to the board, but to my lawyer, a longtime friend. Someone who knew my history with the foundation. I laid out everything. The donations, the inconsistencies, the personal records I had been compiling. He didn't say much after reading it all, just one sentence. Let me look deeper. Meanwhile, I visited one of our very first project sites, a vocational training center in a forgotten part of the city. The building still had Margaret's name on the plaque. The staff remembered her. One even hugged me and said, "It's not the same without her, but we keep going." That hug told me everything. The foundation had lost its soul, but the impact of the real one was still alive, buried beneath layers of self-congratulation and media coverage, but alive. And I wasn't going to let them bury it for good. I stopped attending galas. I declined public thanks. I rerouted all future donations through verified grassroots networks, quietly, without announcement. But I watched. I watched the foundation prepare for its biggest fundraising event to date, the dinner. I wasn't invited, wasn't even acknowledged, and I didn't need to be because by then I knew they had the stage, but I had the truth. The moment I saw my name excluded from the guest list, I smiled. It wasn't surprise, it was confirmation. Confirmation that everything I suspected was not only true, but worse than imagined. They had rewritten the story, so I decided to reclaim the ending. The first thing I did was stop using my personal email. I created a new account under a neutral alias, clean, untraceable to the foundation, to Olivia, to anyone scanning for familiar names. Then I started forwarding every questionable invoice, every inflated expense report to that inbox. I had more than a year's worth of material. I went through it slowly, line by line, late at night, glasses on, pen in hand. The silence in my home was complete. Not heavy, deliberate. There's a kind of discipline you learn after years in engineering. Measure twice, cut once. That mindset became my approach to this. No assumptions, no speculation, just data, patterns, proof. I made 3 calls. 1. To my lawyer, Daniel, who had already begun cross-referencing public filings with our internal documents. 1 to a retired IRS investigator I'd met years back during a corporate audit. And 1 to a former journalist turned independent watchdog who now specialized in non-profit accountability. All 3 agreed on one thing. Something wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Over the next 2 months, I became invisible. I attended no board meetings. I made no comments on social media. I didn't respond to emails from foundation staff. Olivia assumed, I imagined, that I'd drifted off, that I was just an old man whose usefulness had expired with his checkbook. Let her think that. I went back through the vendor lists, found that 4 of the new suppliers had overlapping addresses. Same zip code, same LLC registrar. 1 was registered to a P.O. box in Olivia's mother's name. I flagged it. Daniel started compiling a full legal brief. Not for a lawsuit, for an audit request. Quiet, formal, irrefutable. Meanwhile, I visited old contacts, former staff who had left quietly but uneasily. Some were hesitant to talk. Others opened up right away. There were things we weren't allowed to ask about. Budget stopped making sense. Olivia didn't want transparency. She wanted control. They gave me copies of memos, old calendars, emails. 1 handed me a USB drive and said only I couldn't delete it. That drive contained internal communications between Olivia and her cousin, the head of the PR firm I had already flagged, detailing staged media stories, false impact reports, inflated success metrics. But I still wasn't ready to move. There was one thing left: the dinner. It was being positioned as the foundation's crowning achievement, a celebration of 10 years of transformational impact. Invitations were sent to politicians, corporate donors, media outlets. A documentary crew had even been hired to film the event for promotional use. I made a quiet decision. I would pay for the dinner, all of it. Venue, catering, flowers, security, under the guise of a legacy donor contribution through a third-party channel. No one would see my name, but I attached one condition written in small print: full accounting disclosure post-event, subject to audit. They never read it, or they ignored it. Either way, the moment they accepted that money, they tied themselves to a standard they couldn't meet. And I made one more call to the journalist. Be at the dinner, I said. Don't ask questions. Just film. From the moment you arrive to the moment it ends. He didn't ask why, he just said, understood. Because by then, people close to the truth were starting to understand something crucial. This wasn't about revenge. It was about the record, about memory, about respect. Not just for Margaret, or for me, but for every student they had used as a backdrop to their self-serving pageantry. This time the lights would shine on the right faces, and the cameras would keep rolling. I watched the days tick down toward the event like a chess clock, winding in reverse. Everything was in place, but I wasn't rushing the move. Strategy without timing is just noise. And I'd waited long enough to know that sometimes silence is your sharpest weapon. A week before the dinner, I met Daniel at a diner off the freeway. Neutral ground, no suits, no folders, just a man handing me a sealed envelope with a single phrase: it's airtight. Inside was the formal audit request, supported by over 50 pages of evidence. Bank transactions, contracts, employee testimony, shell company structures, falsified impact reports, and emails that read more like crime scene transcripts than business communication. One copy would go to the IRS, another to the Attorney General's office, a third would wait, sealed, time-stamped and attached to a post-event disclosure campaign built by the journalist, ready for publishing the morning after the gala. The final copy, that one was personal. It would never be mailed, just kept in a drawer. A reminder that truth doesn't always need to shout. It just needs to be unshakable. 3 nights before the dinner, I received an automatic email confirmation. The funds for the gala had cleared. My anonymous contribution had paid for the entire evening. They still hadn't read the clause about financial transparency, or maybe they had, and thought it didn't matter. Let them think that. I walked the city the night before, visited the small coffee shop where Margaret and I used to meet after board sessions. They'd changed the furniture, repainted the walls, but the window seat was still there, still ours somehow. I sat there until close, went home, and slept like I hadn't in years. The morning of the event, I didn't dress for it. I didn't plan to go. I stayed home, watched the sky shift colors through my kitchen window, watered the plants, brewed coffee. The journalist texted at 5:32 p.m. Arrived. I replied with a single word, observe. At 8:14 p.m., another message, this is unreal. And at 9:07 p.m., a photo came through. Olivia mid-speech toasting the future, smiling, surrounded by lights and applause. The irony was brutal. Every light in that room was paid for with misdirection. Every plate, every glass, every flower arrangement, funded by a man whose name didn't make it past the front door. But I didn't need the door. I had the floor. Just not that night. That would come tomorrow. The moment the final speech ended, Daniel filed the official audit request. The journalist uploaded his piece to the Watchdog network. The Foundation's financial documents, internal memos, and incriminating evidence, all linked, all live, all time-stamped. By midnight, Olivia's name was trending, not on a stage, but in headlines. No confrontation, no scandal on site, just silence, then consequences. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I just closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and stood at the window. It wasn't vengeance, it was math. What you take without honesty eventually subtracts you from your own story, and I had simply corrected the equation. By the next morning, the emails had already begun. First, a polite note from a board member asking if I had seen the article. Then another, less polite, from a corporate sponsor demanding an explanation for their logo appearing in a scandal expose. I didn't respond to either. The Watchdog piece was thorough, ruthless, but accurate. It laid out the trail, from my anonymous donations to the misuse of funds, to the PR firms owned by relatives, to the doctored student testimonials and the inflated success metrics. They had staged everything. What they hadn't staged was the funding. That part was real, and so was the fraud. The IRS opened a preliminary case within 48 hours. The Foundation's website went dark by the end of the week. Olivia released a vague statement about operational restructuring and external reviews, but the damage was done. Sponsors withdrew. Partners issued denials. Former staff came forward. It was like pulling a single thread and watching the whole tapestry dissolve. But what mattered most wasn't what the public saw. It was what the auditors found. There was one transaction, a large sum wired to an offshore account that wasn't part of any report, any internal memo or tax return, but it was in my records. I had flagged it 3 months earlier, long before the article, stored with metadata intact and encrypted copies with timestamps. That wire transfer broke the story open. It wasn't just about Olivia anymore. It was organized theft, multiple actors, fake vendors, ghost consultants, a complex network designed to appear legitimate and backed by a brand built on social trust. The Foundation had been hollowed out, and I had been financing the shell. But that's the thing about trust. It leaves a trail, especially when it's broken. The authorities began contacting witnesses. Subpoenas followed. The documentary crew, unaware of any wrongdoing, handed over hours of footage, some of it containing conversations that Olivia had off-script, off-stage, and off-guard. I didn't have to say a word. The story was telling itself, and behind every frame, behind every receipt, was a truth no one could deny. She thought erasing me meant erasing the past. But the past doesn't vanish. It waits. I watched the news quietly. Didn't return any calls. When Daniel asked if I wanted to issue a personal statement, I said no. This was never about me, I told him. It was about her. No, I said. It was about the truth. He nodded. And that was the end of it until one day a package arrived. No sender, no note. Just a stack of original scholarship applications from years ago. Students Margaret and I had helped. Their essays, their goals, their dreams in messy handwriting. One had circled her name on the form. Next to it in blue ink she'd written, "Please don't forget me." I hadn't, and now no one else would either. A few weeks later, Olivia disappeared from the news cycle, not because the story faded, but because it shifted. The foundation's collapse had triggered a broader investigation into similar non-profits. Patterns emerged. Other names surfaced. The media moved on to the larger scandal, but I kept watching from a distance. She was formally indicted 2 months later. Wire fraud, conspiracy, tax evasion. I read the charges in a short press release. No drama, no photos, just text on a white background. Some part of me expected closure, but it didn't feel like that. It felt clean, quietly clean, like closing a book I had never meant to write. Daniel called me with updates, but I never asked for more than headlines. The courts would take care of the rest. She would face what she created, not because I shouted, but because I documented, because I waited, because I never forgot who the foundation was meant to serve. In the background, the journalist's follow-up story ran. It wasn't about the scandal. This time, it was about the people, the programs that had survived, the students who still remembered the original mission. A few mentioned Margaret by name. One quote stayed with me. She didn't talk much, but she made us believe we were worth more than luck. I read it 3 times. Then I turned off the screen. There was nothing left to track, nothing to monitor. I went to the office one last time, what was left of it. The building was mostly empty, boxes stacked, photos removed. I found a small plaque in the corner of a forgotten bookshelf. It had our names on it. I took it home. No. One stopped me. I didn't need a victory speech. I didn't want a last word. I just wanted to remember, quietly, that I had protected something important. Not the money, not the reputation, the story. And stories, when told honestly, outlive the people who try to rewrite them. That night I stood outside. The air was colder than I expected. Still, unmoving, I looked up at the stars, and for the first time in years I didn't feel like I was carrying something heavy. Not guilt, not anger, not grief, just breath, just peace, because I hadn't destroyed anyone. I had simply stopped pretending, and in that stillness I realized something. I wasn't the only one they tried to erase, but I was the one who didn't stay silent. I moved out of the city 3 months after the final verdict. No headlines, no goodbye dinner, just a quiet morning, a moving truck, and a one-way drive to a town most people don't bother to find on a map. It sits at the edge of a forest, bordered by hills, and the kind of silence you don't get anywhere near traffic. Lights or phone towers. I bought a small house, 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, and a porch that faces east. The sunrise here feels older than memory. I didn't bring much, just a few photos, a box of Margaret's books, the plaque from the foundation, and the applications, the ones the students wrote with hope, like it was currency. I built a workbench in the garage, started fixing things. Small things at first, lamps, chairs, radios. Then neighbors started asking. A broken table, a fence post, an engine that wouldn't start. I said yes to all of it, not because I needed the money, but because fixing things, quietly, methodically, makes sense to me. I started a small class at the local community center. Basic woodworking, wiring, problem solving. Half the kids had never held a screwdriver the right way. By week 3, they were teaching each other. One boy asked me, "Were you a teacher before?" "No," I said, "but I learned a lot from someone who was." Sometimes I take long walks through the woods. No phone, no music, just the sound of things that don't care about our headlines. That's where I met her. A dog, stray, thin, cautious, but with eyes that hadn't given up yet. I sat on a rock and didn't speak. Just waited. Took 2 days for her to come close enough to touch my hand. Now she follows me everywhere. I named her Grace. She doesn't bark much, doesn't beg, just stays close, watches, listens, like someone else I used to know. One day, I got a letter, handwritten, no return address, but I recognized the writing. It was from one of the students, the same one who had circled Margaret's name on her application. She wrote, "I'm studying social work now. I want to build something like what you and Margaret started. I don't know if I can, but I'll try." She included a photo, her standing in front of a small group, holding a toolbox. No filters, no branding, just purpose. I put the photo on my fridge, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't about legacy. It was about continuity, about choosing to build even after they've tried to dismantle you. And so here I am, in a house no one mapped, with a dog no one claimed, living a life no one needs to photograph, not forgotten, just free. Because in the end, I wasn't the only one they tried to destroy, but I was the one who didn't stay quiet.